Hi, this is Donna Mullins. I'm president of the League of Women Voters. We put this together because Ukraine and Russia is on our mind. And I happen to have a really interesting and wonderful neighbor, Jennifer Castner, who has personal relationships with people in the Ukraine and Russia and knows a lot about all of Russia. So before we start, what I'd like to do is show a 6-minute video from 60 Minutes that gives you the background in a nutshell so that we'll have something to hang the personal information that Jennifer will provide in a second. Welcome, Jennifer, and Jacqueline, you can come in too. And this is our panel for the night, and I'm willing to I'm gonna listen to, if you have questions, you can do that in the Q&A. I'm trying to do something now. Now I'm going to introduce Jacqueline first of all. So Jacqueline, who was a better interviewer than I am, I invited her to help with questions. Both of us will be asking questions, but I'm going to spend a lot of time looking to see if you have questions, the attendees, and so that you can be part of the conversation. So the plan is that this would be kind of like having wine with friends and talking about stuff. So I thought, Jacqueline, here's your glass of wine. Here. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Don.
Okay, thank you. And Jacqueline is you're interested in this kind of stuff, and we've talked about this before. Okay. And now I want to introduce you to my neighbor, Jennifer. I'm going to ask her some questions so that we all get to know her. Jennifer just impresses the living daylights out of me. She's multilingual. She works for an organization that supports Indigenous people. You'll explain it, and she translates Russian, and she lives places. I mean, if you go on her Facebook thing, there's her and her son in Mongolia, and I mean, you probably slept in a yurt.
Yes, for a week and a half, 10 days on that trip.
There we go. So and I knew that this was very difficult, for Jennifer, and I thought, I'm not getting the personal end of it. So I invited Jennifer and asked her if she'd be willing to talk to all of us about her take on these things so that we could get a personal touch to it. So Jennifer, welcome, and I'm going to give you a glass of wine.
I don't know if I can be quite as slick as Jacqueline, but there we go.
So, Jennifer, you know all things Russian. Probably you think I'm exaggerating, but how did you get involved in this to begin with?
It's a little bit of a meandering story, and I'll skip some of the parts just for the sake of time. But essentially, I decided I graduated from high school in 1989, and which was the time of glasnost and early perestroika in Russia, and the soon to be former Soviet Union. And I already spoke German from a childhood adventure in Germany, and decided that I really wanted to major in a language in my college studies that was more marketable, less common than German, but not outrageously, not like learning Japanese with all the kanji and everything. I wanted something achievable, and Russia was in the news and opening up at that time. And so I decided to major in Russian in college. And I was very lucky to study abroad in Moscow in 1992. Which was just after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And that was a really exciting, challenging time to be a young student, college student in Russia. And then immediately on graduating in 1993, I went to what I thought was an interview and was actually a how soon can you be in Kiev meeting. And I ended up working for my first year and a half out of college for American Councils, is what it's called today, working on their very first merit-based US government, your tax dollars at work funded exchange program, academic year abroad for high school students from all across the former Soviet Union, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere, all across. And it was the pilot year of the program, and I was assigned to visit 20 schools in 20 different cities in Ukraine and live in Kiev and travel around. And it was a very challenging time back then of, there was one phone line for the whole office, all of our staff, and trying to make arrangements and calling up schools where the janitor answers the phone, and me and my Russian that was still not super experienced, trying to get the school director to tell her, meet me at the train station, I want to send your children to America. And so it was a total baptism by fire experience of learning what life is like, and experiencing Ukraine, which is a stunning and really, really beautiful country. So, and then after that, I just sort of followed my nose through a series of other jobs in the nonprofit world, medical philanthropy in St. Petersburg, and working job development for Russian speaking and Bosnian refugees for a while in San Francisco. And eventually I ended up working for an organization that supported grassroots environmental activism around the Pacific Rim. And I was the director of their Russia program, and was really lucky to travel extensively across Siberia and the Russian Far East for a number of years. And then I transitioned away from that into what is now me. I am the Altai Project, and do basically re-granting, finding funders, institutional and private and individual donors who want to support frontline activism, both for environmental justice and Indigenous rights in mainly, I work in a very specific part of central southern Siberia, but I also, based on my previous experience, work all across Russia with frontline activists, and also have been slowly and carefully expanding into Western Mongolia and now Kazakhstan. So keeping the options open as the terrain becomes more challenging. But I've had about 30 years to watch Russia and Ukraine and Central Asia and Eurasia as a whole.
I have to admit, I never thought about Indigenous people in that area of the world. I'm like 100% Polish, and so it's kind of my neighborhood. And so Native Americans and Tasmanians aren't the only Indigenous people in the world.
No. Russia has a lot of different ways of counting its indigenous peoples, and they liberally apply the divide and conquer rule of managing indigenous peoples, but they have over 100 different indigenous peoples living in Russia. Anything from the, and the former Soviet Union, of course, has all of the other ethnicities and ethnoses living in those countries as well. But Russia counts, like I said, Russia counts their indigenous peoples in different ways, but you can pretty readily count over 100 of them for starters, all across the country.
Very interesting. I recall a Facebook post that said you got in a little trouble with the Russian government.
I'm not sure which time. not exactly sure which one that refers to, but the thing with being a funder of activists is that you are automatically assumed to be the problem in Russia. There's a very healthy suspicion of altruistic behavior in Russia, and and I think largely in that part of the world that it's inconvenient for governments to hear their people be dissatisfied with their government's performance, and who better to blame it on than foreigners, right? A time-honored tradition. So when you're a funder of activism, you often get painted with a brush, a broad brush that assumes that you're looking to manipulate or disturb.
I was so proud to know you when I heard that. I know someone. I mean, I don't know your middle name, but I know someone. And so that was really great. So you're really familiar with these things, and after this, feel free to chime in, Jacqueline. And if you attendees, people that are listening to us, if you want to raise your hand, I'll let you ask questions too, and I'll try to keep a lookout on that. But it was several weeks ago that we started hearing about the likelihood of this happening. And so how did you feel? Were you sure that something was going to happen? Were you in connection with people there? What happened? What was that like for you?
Well, as somebody who's immersed in it, and I read the news all day long in Russian and in English and track it in multiple countries around the world, it's been going on for a long time. Really, Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 when it annexed Crimea and inserted itself into local politics in far eastern Ukraine, in Luhansk and Donetsk. And so really, there has been a frozen conflict in that region ever since, in those three regions, ever since 2014. But the troop movements and the media coverage of it more recently, and Western intelligence's really forthright, open public concern about what was building in Russia at the border of Ukraine over the last 6 months was really concerning. But I've seen I've been watching the Putin administration for a long time, and they have always backed away from the brink. And so I was actually really hoping and not believing, frankly, that he was going to invade. I really thought that he would take it to the brink and use it as a bargaining chip, as he has always done, or that he was using it as a distraction, as he has also always done. The Putin administration is a big fan of stirring the pot in other countries like Syria, for example, to use it as a distraction from what's going on domestically. Look, citizens, over there, there's something going on. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain who's stealing all of your tax dollars and putting them in his pockets instead of doing, what he's supposed to be doing for your communities.
That was actually my first question for you, Jennifer, that this is, as I look back to the beginning of this, I realize it began long ago, but as I look back to the beginning of the most recent troubles, like you, I was watching Putin and I was listening to our intelligence services saying that the number of troops, the movements, the logistics of all this looked like invasion. This did not look like troop movements. This looked like invasion. And like you, I thought he would, and of course Putin was denying, and saying that the Western governments were just trying to stir up panic. So I figured that he was going to, at the last minute, pull out, go home and say, look, I told you we were not going to invade. It's just those Western governments who like to stir up panic. So what, do you have any insight into why he didn't do what seemed like the obvious thing, which was to back away when he'd gotten all the attention he needed?
Well, I don't have any, insight, like I don't really know, right? I'm not one of his close advisors, but it's my understanding from reading in all sorts of different English and Russian language sources that he lives a very insular existence. He relies on a very close circle of advisors and then the next circle, but he doesn't have a lot of and there's not, I'm not sure there's incentive for him to be hearing necessarily the truth about his state of readiness or about what's going on. And so, I mean, I guess the only insight I have is that some switch flipped in his mind that made it possible for him. And frankly, I was really surprised and troubled when that happened, because it was for me an indication of a shift away from rational decision making towards not, and that makes it that much more dangerous. And we're, you know, seeing it play out in his willingness to grind a nation of 43 million people into the ground, you know, for his own pride.
Are you? So we know what the Western intelligence was telling us ahead of time. We know what Putin was telling us ahead of time. We know what the reality is. Were you hearing from people, your colleagues or friends, acquaintances in Ukraine and in Russia? What were they thinking?
Well, I want to say first off that my work is much more heavily focused in Russia, and my contacts are in Russia. So I have good friends who have networks in Ukraine, but that is not who I am. So I want to be really clear that I'm representing and able to talk coherently about Russia and what's going on. but I can't speak on behalf of Ukrainians other than what I've read, you know, as a witness. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's interesting. I mean, what are people saying in Russia? I mean, there's a whole mix across the board, and you know, Russians, although Putin has very, very steadily been cranking down on the media and controlling it, if you are curious and you have enough money to have an internet connection, you can access free, accurate information outside of Russia. So if you're paying attention, then you know, as a person living in Russia, what's going on in Russia, even if the TV is telling you otherwise. So, I mean, people had a mix of reactions, but frankly, you know, we didn't spend that much time talking about it because we had bigger fish to fry. You know, I'm supporting activists who are actively trying to stop dams, trying to stop you know, poaching of salmon and snow leopards and our gully sheep, and you know, just working on really frontline environmental issues and in indigenous rights issues. And so we weren't, and Putin has been going on for, you know, how long now? Over 2 decades. Mm-hmm. I should know that number, but I don't. And so it was just sort of more of the same background noise, but we were watching with a lot of concern about the increasing numbers of crackdowns within Russia on basic human rights and environmental rights and that sort of thing. So,
Jennifer, we got a question from Mary Pollack, who's also one of my favorite people, about white supremacy issues in Russia. Is it similar to white supremacy issues in the US? She asked. I lived in Malaysia for a while, and one of the things that I learned there was that racism wasn't invented in the United States, and we're not necessarily the best at it. And so likely you know that, and I'm kind of interested too, as you answer that question about what white supremacy what are the indigenous people? You teach me. Yeah. How is it affecting those people? I mean, there's a war going on. I mean, we know what's happening. That people are being killed, terribly, and suffering in Ukraine. And there's a tremendous group of people that are leaving the country. But you know what? This is bigger than Ukraine, right?
Yeah. Talking specifically about indigenous peoples in Ukraine, again, I'm not an expert, but I do know that Ukraine, the territory that is now Ukraine, has historically been home, obviously, to any number of different ethnicities over time, over the centuries and millennia. More recently, a lot of what remained of the non-Russian, non-Ukrainian ethnicities living in the country were largely more recently confined to Crimea and areas not far from there. After the annexation took place, many of those people have exited. Many of the indigenous peoples in Ukraine have exited Crimea and were living in sort of central southern Ukraine, and now they are, fighting for Ukraine. Indigenous peoples in Russia, Russia divides its indigenous peoples into 3 categories, and it only actually recognizes specific individual rights of what it calls small numbered minorities, small numbered peoples, which means that there are fewer than 50,000 total population. And it has about 40 peoples that it recognizes as small numbered. And by small numbered, most of the time we're talking about anywhere between 100 remaining on Earth to maybe a few thousand, 2,000 or 3,000. And so they're very endangered and at risk and struggling for their rights. And unfortunately, I would like to be able to tell you that Russia is doing something to help them, but it is in fact working very hard to assimilate them. So there's small number of peoples, and then there are also what they call titular nations, where if you have 50,000 or more, then they give you basically an administrative unit. So usually it's a republic. So the Republic of Altai, Republic of Buryatia, Tiva, Caucasia, and those it's a different kind of it's more of a collective right to a territory, but it doesn't give you other individual rights to resources per se, like fish or hunting or plants. And then there's also the very conveniently ignored large indigenous populations that I'm always talking about, and few people do categorize this way, of, in the Caucasus and southwestern Russia, there's the Chechens, the Ingushetyas, the Abkhaz, there's a whole number of peoples there, and Russia they're just people. They don't even get a capital letter. And it's again, divide and conquer, convenient to divide them up that way. You get a little bit of everything. There's Turkic speaking peoples, there's Ugric speaking peoples, there's Altaic peoples, which is Turkic is part of the Altaic language family, or is it the way around? So there's lots of different larger linguistic ways of categorizing the indigenous peoples, but they're spread all across. Some of them are reindeer herders in the Arctic, and some of them are goat and sheep herders in across the southern ranges. There's there's a whole spectrum of indigenous peoples, fishing peoples, hunting peoples, a little bit of everything, and a lot of them are working very hard to preserve their cultures and languages and traditional life ways.
So related to that idea, Putin in inserting himself into eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, talked about a genocide of Russian-speaking peoples, which sounds like a bit of a projection. Taking what he essentially is doing to the peoples you're describing and projecting that onto what he's calling Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. Do you have any idea of who lives in those regions, in Donetsk and Luhansk, the areas that he seems most interested in? Are there indigenous people there? Are they mostly Russian speaking? Do they want to be Russian? Do you have any idea what the truth of that is?
Again, the caveat that I'm not an expert, but I'll share what I do know, and I can't quote statistics, but if you look at a map, if you look at sort of the dominance of whether Russian is spoken or Ukrainian is spoken, you'll see that largely the western half of Ukraine speaks Ukrainian, and largely the eastern half tends to speak more Russian. That is not a clean line at all, and there is lots of mixing, and there are Ukrainian enclaves all through eastern Ukraine in terms of language. But the people who live in Ukraine are Ukrainians, and they are passionate about it, and there are very few of them, very few, I would say, that have any interest in becoming part of Russia. The Crimea was a little simpler for Putin to annex because it is very heavily ethnically Russian and is the home of Russia, for a long time was the home of the Soviet Unions and then Russia's Black Sea fleet, right? And so that area was I don't know, things happened differently in 2014 than are happening now. So there is an ethnic Russian population in Eastern Ukraine, but I don't have any knowledge of any interest in that part of the country seceding from Ukraine. I think that it's again, not an expert, that things were perfectly fine until somebody came in and started stirring the pot, more or less. There are really complex politics that I'm not going to go into, but you can go and look up about Ukrainian nationalism and Russian nationalism in Ukraine, Ukraine's a complicated place, just like any country in the world that's had multi-layered history and interactions of ethnic groups. So if you're interested in following that more, you should go and look into it.
Mary asked another question about they keep on, Putin keeps on talking about Nazism and we've got to get rid of the Nazism. Do you know what that's about?
I mean, it's right in line with the rich irony of what Jacqueline was talking about. And it's, again, complicated histories. If you look up somebody named Stepan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian nationalist around the time of the end of World War II, he had a complicated history and was willing to kill people in favor of Ukrainian nationalism. And tossing around Nazism and fascism is a really popular thing to do in a lot of places. So it's not incredibly unusual to find it happening in that part of the world too. The Soviet Union paid a tremendous loss for good and bad reasons in World War II. Millions and millions and millions and millions of people died, and that pain, that wound is still there across, not just in Russia, but in Ukraine as well. And it's understandable, but it is a ridiculous argument that Putin is using. There's no doubt, of course. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that it's not that surprising. But it's a convenient argument, especially when you control the media.
It's a useful argument, but kind of a big lie. When I lived in Malaysia, I went to the Russian embassy and watched videos at the Russian embassy about World War II. It was a completely different take than ours. And I found it fascinating. And I had not realized until then, and I checked my facts afterwards, how many millions of people died. It's horrible. It's horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And that would change. That would change a lot on how you felt after the war. Yeah. And I think that they thought that they deserved the Union of Soviet Republics because of the great loss that they had in that.
Yeah,
I think it binds people together as well. Before COVID, not long before COVID though, we were on a trip, just a short trip, Jennifer, to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on. And talking to Kazakhs, they want to point out the losses in World War II that is still, in the same way that World War II figures greatly in British minds, it figures even more, I think, in Russian and Kazakh minds, because the losses were so awful. And because the rest of the world seems to have not noticed that the losses were so awful.
Mm-hmm.
They lost an entire generation of men.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, something like 3% was all that was left after the war of that generation of men.
It was horrific. And meanwhile, when each country tells its story of World War II or whatever war, but I think of World War II, they tell their story of that war. So when you say, Donna, that the American idea of what happened in World War II is what you learned, well, I learned the British one, and we always thought that the Americans showed up a bit late for that.
Fair.
And I never learned that the Russians had suffered many more losses than anyone else, and so I can understand the sort of burning resentment that this enormous sacrifice went on, and the rest of us didn't really acknowledge that.
Yeah.
I think it binds people together. It certainly makes the Kazakhs that we met anyway, many of them still think of the Soviet Union and think of Russia now. Yeah, Russia now and the Soviet Union then. They think of them both rather fondly. They speak Russian as a linked language, but there are obviously other languages as well. Mm-hmm. In fact, I worry about them now, don't you? I worry that they might be next.
Yeah, that is sort of the question of, if we, the world, don't come together and stop him in Ukraine, what's next? I mean, because it's clear that he is willing to, and I'm really talking about Putin here, right? Putin and his cronies. I'm not talking about Russians. I'm not talking about the country of Russia. I'm talking about Putin. So it's very clear that I mean, and he has always spoken openly about how he really, was deeply upset by the breakup of the Soviet Union, the great empire, and that he, then talks about, these other countries, satellite countries that he sees as satellite countries around Russia as part of that family in his mind, regardless of whether or not they want to be part of the family. So yeah, I mean, I was actually spent a good amount of time last week talking to colleagues in Kazakhstan about matters, and we were talking about how dramatically Russophobia has increased in Kazakhstan, and not of their own ethnic Russian population. There's a very large ethnic Russian population in Kazakhstan, and again, they are happy living in Kazakhstan. If they weren't, they could have left a long time ago, and many did when the Soviet Union broke up. But many of them have stayed, and so they're talking specifically about Russophobia to Russians coming from Russia, and that they're also seeing, as we've seen in the US, Russia using information warfare and propaganda to infiltrate their society in the form of propaganda about how Russians are discriminated against in Kazakhstan, and how Russia, is watching out for you and will protect you if you need protecting. And gee, that sounds extremely familiar and concerning. Kazakhstan shares a very long border with Russia, direct border with Russia. And while it does have a military, it's not able to stand up to the Russian military, such as it is.
Which brings us to the question about what for? Why does he want Ukraine? Why might he want Kazakhstan? What for?
To rebuild the empire, because he doesn't see them as he sees them as as smaller subordinate states that.
It's hard to imagine invading and keeping Ukraine, never mind invading and keeping Kazakhstan, which is enormous.
Yeah, well, he already has an enormous country, so he's managed to hold on to that, despite its declining population. I think Russia's population is, I don't know what it was at its peak, but it's only 146 million people for the largest country in the world, and the vast majority, 6 million, only 6 million people live in Siberia and the Far East, and all the rest live in Western Russia. I think that's right.
You were there. You were there during the fall of the Soviet Empire, and
I was there immediately after.
Immediately after. And how did people feel? Did they feel like they had just lost something and that it wasn't right? Something was taken from them?
Well, I was a student, dewy-eyed, living with a group of students, and we had some contact with people that we encountered on the street, and it was a really challenging time. Inflation, all of their entire economy was thrown up in the air and came down all higgledy-piggledy, and food was a problem. My best friend from college, she studied in Moscow the semester before the semester. When was it? So she was there in this, I don't know, she was there a semester before me, and her group was hungry when they were there. It was hard to find food. They ate a lot of oatmeal. My trip studies there the following semester, I spent a lot of time foraging for food. I could find it, but I had to go to one metro station to the store that had canned tomatoes, and I had to go to the other metro station, you know, a transfer and 4 stops away to get rice. And I had to go to the fruit store to see if they had either rotten milk or peaches that day. You know, there was a lot of hunting and gathering of groceries. People were busy, you know, trying to live their lives and adapt to this incredibly unstable ground underneath them. And so certainly some people were nostalgic for the stability and predictability of life before the breakup. But I think other people were invigorated and inspired by their newfound freedom, and you know, different people.
Some of the questions, Jennifer, are about the Orthodox Church.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any insight into whether that plays a part? I know it plays a part in Putin's explanations from time to time, but I assume he says that because there's a willing audience who perks up their ears and listens to that. So do you think it's an important aspect of what's going on here?
Yeah, this is straying a little bit outside my more immediate experience and knowledge, but certainly Putin's administration works closely with the church, with the Russian Orthodox Church, where they can, and certainly Putin's, you know, focus and constant calling for traditional values in society would be in lockstep with the church. And there's been a great deal of, you know, the church clearly is not lacking for money and resources. They're building little chapels all over the place, just because, you know, just to be a constant reminder of the immediacy of it. I think I missed part of the question, did I?
No. I just wondered,
Okay.
you know, how widespread the church is, how important the church is to people.
Yeah.
And is this when Putin uses this as an apparent explanation for what's going on, do people buy it?
Well, as you probably know, you know, during the Soviet time, religion was really frowned upon, right? And so in ways that we're seeing play out in other countries as well, that faith and religion, you know, remains a centerpiece for some people, but it's also something that's a much weaker institution than it once used to be. That said, there are still plenty of people that at least that either, you know, are culturally Russian Orthodox or are actively Orthodox. So it's a wide range. It's just another tool in Putin's toolbox. From my perspective.
You're going back to my only overseas experience, really. When in Malaysia, it's a Muslim country, there's only 3% Christian, but those Christians are fervent as all get out because there's only 3%. Is that the same thing that's going on there? It's not that many, but since there are so few, they got to be fervent. More, there's more fervor to it.
I don't know. I can't really respond to that. I mean, Putin is very worried about religions that are not Russian Orthodoxy, right? There's, you know, certainly, and I don't know the exact reasons for that, other than that it could be seen as an attempt to, you know, self-determine, self-identify, you know, find your own way that's not the Putin way, right? In the form of, so for example, Jehovah's Witnesses, that religion is actually has been named extremist in Russia, and if you are caught practicing it or talking about it, you can be arrested and jailed, and people are fairly regularly. There are some other religions that are definitely on the watch list of undesirable religions. Most of them are, you know, and they also do worry about their you know, some of their Islamic communities in different parts of Russia.
How does that aspect, that religion aspect, how does that affect the Indigenous communities that you're working with? Are they also culturally Russian Orthodox? or are they culturally Muslim, or are they something else entirely?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's interesting is that you can still see the after effects, not the afterglow, but you can still see the effects of the Soviet era in communities all across the former Soviet Union, nowadays Central Asia, and even in satellite countries that were in the orbit, we could say. And so you see that unifying Soviet culture that's still there in the shadows or out in the open, depending on what aspect of it you're looking at. And the same, can be said for, the first explorers, the first expanders of the Russian Empire were missionaries, right? Russian Orthodox missionaries are the ones who went out into Siberia and the Far East and established outposts and alongside explorers too, but the Russian Orthodox Church had a very strong role in expanding the Russian Empire. And you still see those influences today. Where was I going? And so in terms of indigenous spiritual practices, they vary dramatically. There's a lot of, in the regions that I work in, there's a lot of animism, shamanism, Tibetan Buddhism. There's a fairly strong influence in central southern Siberia. But there's a lot of animism, paganism, and shamanism in the regions, and and you can see it. You can see influence of Russian Orthodoxy, mingling in with these other spiritual practices as well.
And the Russian government is okay with that just now, or it's not big enough problem for them to pay attention to?
They worry a lot about attempts to for self-determination, self-identification, self-governance. Those are the things that really worry them. During the Soviet era, the Soviets really worked hard to stamp out all religion, not just Russian Orthodoxy, but also all forms of animism and paganism and shamans, and those people were specifically spiritual practitioners of all stripes were specifically shipped off to the Gulag camp system and repressed, meaning killed directly or indirectly by their treatment in the gulags.
So the people that you work with are part of Russia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're indigenous people in those areas. So they're different ethnicities, but they're Russian. Are they, Mary said something about the white stuff. Again, I'm Polish. I kind of always felt connected to Ukraine. We went, my father was more in tune with his Polish background, and we would go to Ukrainian dancers and stuff like that, kind of the same, and Hungarian and those kinds of stuff. So it was kind of a Slavic thing going on, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Yeah. And so are these, do the people look the same?
No. They, Jacqueline saw this on her travels, I'm sure. I mean, there's a lot of the Asiatic appearance, and Turkic appearance as well. It's hard to talk about this correctly, but there were clearly people who were not your basic Caucasians, and there's a great deal of mixing and intermingling at this point across the region. But so, like, for example, the region that I work in Altai Republic, it's a titular republic, so it has the Altaian people. There's about 63,000 of them right now existing in the world, and at least, and then 60,000 of them live in Altai Republic. So they are a titular people. But then there are also 5 small numbered peoples that live in Altai Republic, as well as scattered across a few other nearby regions. So there's the Telengit, the Chuvash, the Teliut, the Tubalar, and the Kumandin peoples, and those are all small numbered peoples that are fewer than 5,000 each, roughly. And they all speak sort of dialects, or depending on whether you're talking to a linguist or them as individual peoples, they speak different Altaic languages that can be divided in different ways by different political and linguistic slants.
So the name of the place you work for is Altai?
Altai.
Altai, and that's from Altaic?
Yeah, one way or the other. Yeah, the Altai Sayan Mountains. If you've read in the news about the Denisova cave, evidence of intermixing of oh, I'm digging deep here, of the different hominin peoples. And you see that they found evidence of them going across the Bering Land Bridge or somehow reaching North America and traveling through this whole region. That cave is in Altai, right on the border with the next region over. And so anytime you see the Denisova cave, that is this place where we have evidence of 50,000 years of hominin history in that cave. And so it's an incredibly important place from the perspective of the Silk Roads. It was at a crossroads, both for trade routes and for spiritual practices. Kyrgyz people from Kyrgyzstan often make pilgrimages to Altai because they trace some of their historical roots back there. So it's a really important place, and for visualizing it, we don't have a map, but so if you think about Russia across the top, and then there is underneath it, there's Kazakhstan, and there's Mongolia, which I'm mirroring it for you guys. It's probably confusing. And then right where Mongolia and Kazakhstan almost come together at the bottom of Russia that's where Altai Republic is. It has a 35-mile border with.
And in fact, it came to pass.
Sorry, I was trying to find the end.
Yeah. So you can go to the altaiproject.org website, and we have a map there of it that shows it. But anyway, it's in the center of the Eurasian continent.
Okay, I want to it's 7:53 now. I want to go back to Ukraine and Russia. So we're doing, along with most of the European nations and a whole lot of nations in the world, sanctioning Russia, and it's hurting them terribly. And the people that are being hurt are not the people that caused this to happen. So have you heard from people, and just tell me about it.
Yes, and it's not just in Russia. These have knock-on effects in all of the nations that have close ties to Russia. So the really immediate fallout is currency fluctuations. The bottom fell out of the Russian ruble, and that has knock-on effects to all of the currencies that are closely tied economically to the Russian ruble. If I think about my partners, for example, I work with wildlife biologists who use GPS trackers. They deploy them on animals so they can track their migrations and movements through the landscape or flying. And so their credit cards don't work, and so they can't use their credit cards internationally to pay for the cellular coverage for their GPS trackers that are on birds or other transboundary animals. The databases that they use, they've been, the West has just said, nope, sorry, we're not hosting servers in Russia anymore. So scientists are having to completely retool their research, which is no small thing. Certainly, all of the electronics and foreign car parts, or even car parts for Russian cars tend to be manufactured outside of Russia. Russia has been a petrostate for a very long time. Its entire economy is built around oil and gas exports, right? And metals and exports, raw exports. It doesn't have a lot of value added industry. And they depended a great deal on industry outside of Russia to support their economy with parts and products and so forth. And so all of that stuff is either gone or on its way gone. And so all of those everyday products are gradually going to be leaving the shelves. And, Russia, after 2014 and the sanctions that happened then, it's invested significantly into trying to make its own economy more self-sustainable in agricultural terms and food production terms especially, but in other ways as well. And they worked really hard at that. And so it may take a little more time for it to really start to bite, but it's not good, and it is definitely having really broad impacts on everyday people across Russia. And it's all, you know, and the sanctions are also impacting oligarchs who I don't feel at all sorry for, but they don't have a lot of leverage over him either right now. It's very difficult for me to envision a scenario in which the sanctions are the solution. I just don't see that as the solution. I could see the unfortunate sudden absence of Putin would be one possible solution. It would be catastrophic within Russia because there is no succession plan for him after he's gone. But it would probably bring things to a halt in Ukraine very rapidly, is my guess. Or the West enforcing a no-fly zone, which it doesn't want to do for moderately understandable reasons. But on the other hand, are we really willing to just leave a nation of 43 million people behind? Giving them weapons isn't enough.
What I know it's still early days, but the people that you know who are already suffering from these, from our sanctions that we've put on and other nations have put on, what are you getting any feedback about their take on it, that they understand why, that they know, who are they blaming?
Well, like I said, if you are curious and have access to the internet, then you are well informed in Russia about what's going on and who's to blame. And they've been watching, Putin slowly, and not so slowly in some cases, tighten the thumb screws for decades now. I mean, this is not news. This is not, people, generally know that he's a bad actor inside Russia. And the people that are support him, in my opinion, and most of what I've seen other people talking about, leaving your TV on the background, leaving the radio on the background is really common. We do it here in the US. It's extremely common in Russia. And it's like having a poison IV drip hooked up to your arm. It's really, really toxic. It is not free. It is not informed. And even when it's not talking actively about news, it is nasty, just like our reality TV is nasty. It's not, not representing the values that of love and kindness and caring and community. And so when you're hooked up to that all the time, it's easy to get sucked in. Also, the really important thing to know is that Russia and the Soviet Union, and even before it, has a long history of forcing people to show up to the polls, of forcing workers, busloads of workers from a company are taken to a square to participate in a march. It's not a voluntary thing. You want your job, you go to this march. And so now we're watching things that really, really break my heart and my colleagues, my Indigenous colleagues' hearts, of seeing these Indigenous minorities being forced to put on their traditional costumes and clothing and perform their traditional dances in the forms of Z's and just praising Putin to the sky. And it's revolting and disgusting. And that either they're doing it because they're uninformed, or they're doing it because they're trying to protect their communities. And that there are some people who are true believers, but they are misinformed.
Most are just afraid.
I'm really sorry to hear that. It's 8 o'clock, and I want to respect everybody's time, and especially yours, Jennifer. I really appreciate this. It's a different take than we hear on the news. And what can we do? Not much, but what can we do? What can we do to support? What places are safe that would work to support people? What could?
Yeah, there in terms of Ukraine, there are great groups to support. Really well-known ones. There's the International Rescue Committee is doing great work with refugees. The International Fund for Animal Welfare is doing great work inside Ukraine to help shelter animals that are left behind. There is United Help Ukraine. I think that's the word order. United Help Ukraine is a Ukrainian nonprofit that has a chapter in the US through which they're channeling funds The Kiev School of Economics is also taking donations. You can find them online. And they are specifically providing those emergency medical kits to help people who have been like hit by shrapnel or something like that, to help them, you know, these very specific medical kits that you want to have for bombing situations, for lack of a better word. So those are all great options. My organization is AltaiProject.org. And I am still working to this day to support frontline activists in Russia. I'm working with a network of other activists who are outside of Russia, and we are providing resources to help people figure out what to do in Russia, what to do, you know, if they're thinking about other options, and we're trying to provide it in the safest way possible. You know, we are really careful and also have a ton of experience collectively in supporting activists and working alongside them.
If you send me the contact information, I'll make sure that everyone who's registered for this gets a copy of where they can, because I know that, but the description was very helpful, and I really trust you. I want to wrap this up. I want to thank Jacqueline, who always makes me look bad, and Jennifer. I really feel humbled to be with both of you, and thank you. This is a little outside of the League of Women Voters mission, but we are a whole bunch of people that are interested in the world and current affairs. And so this is really helpful. And I really appreciate you coming. And one of the things I'd like to remind you,
yeah,
we could lose our democracy too.
Right.
Right. And so
sorry, Don. Sorry, just go ahead.
Well, and so I really wanted to encourage people to do what they can to support, promote the vote and the constitutional amendment that will make voting a fundamental right in Michigan. Can't do anything about the country. I sure the heck can do something about Michigan. Jacqueline?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jennifer. I learned a lot tonight, but the one thing that I think is sticking with me are some of the things that I hadn't thought of about the parallels between this country and Russia or the Soviet Union. When you mentioned sending missionaries out, something I had not thought about before. And there were other points tonight when you were talking too that made me think we need to value our democracy and work to keep it. And remember the awful things that we've done in the past and promise ourselves not to do the same things in the future, and start by supporting the vote in Michigan first.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been such an honor to be able to talk about this, and I really appreciate it. And I also really value Donna's work and your work in the League of Women Voters. And I have recently started being a poll worker, and I really, really also value the right to vote. And having moved here from Michigan, from California into Michigan, and seeing the contrast in voter access between those two states, it's really telling how incredibly important it is, especially here in Michigan, that we protect our democracy by voting. Vote, 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 vote.
Okay, thanks a lot. And we'll hear from you all later. Okay, bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Bye-bye.